If you care about security for your Next.js app, stop using top-level use server. It's way too easy to leak data. Top-level use server creates endpoints for all exported functions, even if they're never used on the client. One accidental export can cause a ton of damage. Oh boy. Y'all probably expect me to come out here super defensive, like I'm the Vercel guy, right? They pay me, so I'm going to come out and just say this is all fine. This video is not sponsored. Vercel has no say in what I say here. They might even be mad at me for some of the stuff I'm going to say, because I almost entirely agree with Reese. This is scary, and we should understand what these tools do in a deep way, because it's not as obvious as one might think. Let's dive into this and what's going on, because I think it's important for us to understand. Before we go any further, I want to make sure we understand what useServer does, because useServer does some slightly different things in slightly different ways. There's some education to be had here. So we're going to make a form, and in this form, we'll have a button, type is submit, and the form will have an action, which this is where actions become useful. We're going to go in here. We're going to mark this as use server, and we're going to console.log, I'm on the server, my mistake, async. Cool. So now we have here, I'll open up the console, because when I hit this, Windows not defined, because that code ran on the server, not on the client. So if I go back and delete window and run this again, that code runs on the server. See, I'm on the server. What useServer does is it tells the Next.js compiler, hey, this function isn't a traditional function. This isn't just for you to call between different places in the same service. useServer is effectively a door that enables client-side code to hit this server-side function. It might make more sense if I break it out a little here. So if I was to async function handle submit, we can do the same thing in here with the useServer. And then I pass this handle submit function to the action instead, and it does the same thing. Things can get a little interesting once we're composing stuff though. So first off, if I define this function in here, let's say there's a variable that's defined when the page renders, like const sum number equals math.random times 100. Now we have this number. We want to log it. So we put that there. And now when we submit and we go to the console code, I'm on the server, here's the random number. Since this component has context, not literally React context, but it has the context of this number that's unique to this render, because theoretically, every time somebody renders this page, they're going to get a different number. We can prove that by saying console.log rendering with some number. So now when I load this page, it rendered with 3.9 whatever. And then if I submit, it's submitting with 3.9. The reason it's able to do that is it's actually embedding that number, that value that we have in the closure here inside of the form, so that when it calls this function, it has access to that data. It's almost like we moved this out here, and then in here we have an input that has a default value that is some number. The reason that this works this way is so we don't need to know the context of what existed in the component when you call that function. At first, it wasn't encrypted, which made this horrifying, but now I actually kind of like it. I have these items, and I want to be able to list them. We've all done this before. Items.map item. Thank you, Super Maven, for being based as always. So here we have items.map, item, key, item, ID, item. Cool. And if we go back to the page, 1, 2, 3. Here's where things get interesting. What if I want to be able to delete any one of these? If I want a little delete button on the side here. This is where I actually think the composition of actions gets really cool. Submit, we're going to make this an X button. Also going to class name flex gap 4, just put space between them. So I have that little X button. Nice. Action equals async, use server. And since we have the context of what ID we have here, it's actually quite easy. I should also make this a let just to make it easier. Or items equals items.filter, and then revalidate path. So I have to import. Cool. So what's happening here is, since the ID of this item exists in the props being passed to this component, it's actually included in the scope of the form so that we can just call the ID we pass to this component. It's actually magical in the sense that we have this simple items function. This could be a row in a table, anything like that. This is so convenient, because now I can just dump useServer here. I can call props the same way I would in any other function in here, and this just behaves. So if I go here, we can take a look at these items, and you'll see each of these forms has some data embedded in it, or it should. Yeah. So each of these has this hidden data, and that hidden data is just the ID for the thing that's being included in the scope there. So now if I hit delete on any of these, it removes it. It's that simple. And that is a magical pattern. It makes enclosures of concerns and the architecture of your stuff really, really clean. If you have, let's say, a table and you want a delete button that you just pass a prop to, now that delete button can own its behavior. The catch is that in order for that to work, it has to include the context of what that has, whatever's enclosed in that function's like closure inside of the form, but it does it encrypted so you can actually see the values. So although this might seem scary, it's actually pretty safe. Where do I think this problem could actually happen is an important question. I should probably have answered earlier, so I'm going to answer it now. Let's say that the sensitive data function isn't actually a do not use, it's an internal. So we want to use this internally. Notice that I deleted the export. The reason is anything doing stuff internally like this, we don't want exported. We explicitly don't want this to be accessed other places. So the solution here would be to export a different function that calls this. So we have export async function user access data. And here we grab the headers, we check that it's a secured user, and then we call the internal sensitive data function. Anything that has the word export should do a security check like this. The thing to look for if you're a code reviewer working in code bases like this is making sure anytime there's an export in an action file or in something marked use server, that everything exported has an authentication check of some form. And if it's not exported, it doesn't matter. This isn't exposed. Only the exports are exposed. The way that this would become a mistake, the way this could potentially be an issue, is if I'm a dev working on another file here, like other actions.ts, and I need this internal sensitive data thing, I might blindly go here and export it so I have access to this in another file. And now I've just made that an endpoint, even if I'm using it internally for something like this. That's the scary, unintuitive part that is going to cause issues. If you're looking for where the problem exists, that's where the problem exists. If you blindly go export something that shouldn't be exported, and then that's missed in code review, that's a red flag. That can cause problems. That's a thing worth looking for. But that's the only case I can imagine where this would be a problem, is doing something as innocent as exporting this function that we're using internally here, exposing this. So the way I would do this is I would have something like a utils function. So utils.ts, I might even put a comment on top that's like, do not export this file, and then import server only. Now we're sure this file is only on the server and won't be use servered, not use server this file. Now we're certain that won't happen. Now I can call this internal function in other places. And even though it's exported, it's not exposed because it's exported from a file that doesn't have use server. I hope that makes it clear where the problems could be here and what could cause this. But I promise you, this is just the GraphQL problem of security again. I just went on a long tangent because I want to show you guys that this isn't actually what we're talking about today. If I wanted to move this out, let's say I wanted this delete button in another file because separation of concerns is super important. We'll make an actions.ts file. And here, well, I guess I can't really use items because items was in the context of that. So let's come up with a different example. Let's say instead of screwing with items, it will just, I don't know, console.log user was here. We'll make this more proper. Export async function or user visited. Cool. Something like that. So now you have this export async function. We could put the use server here, but I don't think we're able to import that. I'm actually curious if this works or not. Okay, that does work. Cool. So if you want to put a function in a different file, mark it use server this way and export it, that all works fine. The other way you can do this though is putting the use server up top like this. So now we have this export async function user visited. And if we go here and click the buttons, user was here, user was here. That all works. The use server on the top here is effectively telling the compiler, hey, any async functions in this file should be treated the same way an action is treated in an existing file. So when we put the use server up here, we are telling React, hey, these functions can be called like endpoints. These can be posted to, which is an important detail here. I want to be clear though, you can't just write this in a client file. So I can't like have use client up top and then use server in here, because use client is saying we're sending this JavaScript file to the client. Use server is saying we're exposing this function to the client. So they're different things entirely. I know it seems like they're similar because their names are so similar. They're not. So where's the danger here? Well, sometimes when you're exporting from a use server file, the behaviors aren't very intuitive. The first one is, let's say that we wanted to do the items thing again. So we'll define items in here and we'll export it too. Well, now we're going to get an error because you can't actually export anything but a promise from a use server tagged file, because they don't want you to use this to expose things like data, like classes, like components. They want you to expose this as functionality, as endpoints, effectively. So what is the issue here then? If we can't export things we shouldn't, and we can't export functions, what's the problem? Well, let's say there's a function in here we're not ready to export, like sensitive data. We'll even do not use sensitive data. And in here we'll log, let's go make a fake environment, .env, sensitive data equals, I hope this doesn't leak. So now we have this sensitive thing in the environment. We can even log it here, env.sensitive, what did I call it? Yeah, sensitive data, process.env, that's sensitive data. So if we go here, we're not gonna like have that get hit or anything. Like we aren't running that function. I'll change this to sensitive, do not touch. And maybe we even return that sensitive data, process.env.sensitive data. So now we have this, we're returning this sensitive data, but we're not binding it anywhere. We're not calling this. We import the user visited function, but we're not importing this. So what's the issue? Well, the issue is that the way the compiler works is for every route, it goes through all of the imported files to see in order where the use server calls are. The way that this effectively works is when the compiler runs, it goes through each of the different places that a use server exists in the file tree for that route. So if this route has an import to actions, and in here we have two things that are use server tagged, this would be the equivalent of effectively putting this here and here, basically the same thing. So now this is ID 1, this is ID 2. Even though this one isn't used, it is still exposed and it is still creating an endpoint, so to speak, for that function. Anytime you have a use server function that is imported and in the import tree of a given route, it is now exposed as an endpoint, even if you don't directly bind it. Because what this is effectively doing is letting you post to that page route and have it run the code that you've bound. I wanted to confirm that if you don't import the file on a given page, this won't be a problem, which is the case. So this page demo doesn't import any actions, so it doesn't have this. The actions that are defined on a route are specific to that route. So we did import the actions file here. So these actions are included on the root/route, but on the /demo route, they're not included because I didn't import any actions here. So what do I mean by included? That's a great question, and we're going to elaborate on that now. So here we have that root route again. We have the buttons that don't do anything at the moment. And if we take a look at the code for these, we'll actually see, if I search that again, that we have some stuff here that includes it, specifically this page.js file, which is very interesting. Let's grab the contents of that quick. In here, if I look for that ID, which I'll grab again here, remember, all of the actions have an ID assigned to them so that the React code on the server knows which action each form is attached to, because all of them are just posting to the same endpoint. So they're using these IDs to figure out which action you actually want to run. And here we see, oh no, do not use sensitive data. It's actually included in here. That's scary. What's even scarier is that we can hit that. You know what? Let's just do this as a curl. Why not? I'm going to delete the cookie because we almost certainly don't need that. What we do need is to identify the action. Just pasted the curl. And here we get a response undefined. If we were to go add a response to the action, return, cool, data hello world. Now we get back data hello world as the response from that curl call. Reminder, this curl call is just me going to the browser, right click, copy as curl for that request that I did. So what happens if we swap that ID? Well, I already have the command where I swapped it. You can see the 6DD here. So we're gonna run this instead. Oh, subscribe to Theo? What happened? Oh, sensitive data got changed. Hopefully you're already subscribed or you're going to deal with leaks like this in the future. Make sure your stuff's secure. Hit that sub button. Anyways, the issue here is very simple, but also easy to miss if you're not paying enough attention when you write these things. Since useServer is effectively saying everything in this file is now exposed as an endpoint, this is exposed even if we're not using it. We got a good point here from Emmy in chat. Is it really a bad thing to have someone able to enumerate your endpoints? That's a really good question. It depends on how your stuff's architected. This is effectively the GraphQL problem, where if you have anything in your GraphQL schema, every user can at least call it. The solution to a problem like this is to have an auth check of some form. We have data from this call being hit, and we can use that data to verify that this user is the right user. We have access to headers. So if I import headers from Next, I don't know, what do we want to have as the header? We'll say that there's a secure header that we'll check for. If we won't do X forwarded for, we'll say secured user does not equal key, then we'll immediately throw error not a secured user. Otherwise, we'll pass it. So if we do a check like this, and I go back here, and I call this again, we get this error response because this error was thrown to us because we shouldn't have been able to do that. And you can even see the error in that response of not a secured user. But if I instead just return data, you're not a secured user, same deal, data, you're not a secured user. If I go back to that curl request and we manually happen to know what that header is, secured user, and now we have that in here. If we run this again, data subscribe to Theo, because we are actually validating that this user has permission, in this case, using the secured user header, but you could use anything like cookies the same way. So the lesson here is, first off, make sure you understand what these things do before you use them. Use server is turning all of these functions into endpoints that users can hit, which emphasizes the importance of one big key thing. Make sure any action you create verifies the user has permission to do the thing. If you don't want users to hit this sensitive data function, make sure you check, because effectively every user can hit this function. When you're exposing things with use server, you have to assume that this function can be run by anybody. I think a lot of the issue that's happening here is that web developers aren't used to dealing with access control. They're used to these functions being automatically handled with auth because a backend dev did it, or they're using something like Create T3 app where we handle it for you with secured procedures. If you're writing these use server calls yourself, that means you're writing API endpoints yourself. We are defining an API here the same way we would with GraphQL. In fact, GraphQL has these same problems times 10. So we need to make sure in all of these functions that the right people can do them. And as a code reviewer, as a in-the-know dev that's watching videos like this is kind of your responsibility. We're no longer just writing JavaScript for the client. If we're using these functions, if we're taking advantage of these core features in the new React model, it is important for us to go out of our way to make sure anything we're exposing to users is secured. And I'll be honest, this has even bit us before. When we first did the early access of upload thing, we weren't authenticating our actions well enough because we assumed if you can't get to the route, you can't use the actions, which was a mistake. We learned these lessons as a community, and I really want to push these points so I'm not the only one getting burnt by it. If you're not authenticating the functions, then anyone can hit them. Ryan Florence jumped in with a spicy take, and honestly, I think I agree. This doesn't concern me. Use server means turn these exported functions into endpoints for the client. Once you know that, you won't export a function with sensitive data. I get that when you're new to it, you might export a function you didn't intend to be an endpoint. Yep. And then it's up to the framework to salt and sign the IDs it sends to the client, just like sign cookies, yada, yada. I think it's cool, great abstraction. Would you really trust a code base with 1,000 people working on it for all of them to not make this mistake? Yeah, I personally think once you have a code base of that size, you're almost certainly doing a really good job of auditing and linting these things. Like, my personal understanding is that these problems always exist in big code bases, especially with, again, I hate to keep poking at GraphQL, but it is so guilty of this problem. So the GraphQL schema like this, where we have company, not only do you have to verify and validate company, you have to validate every one of these fields. Because let's say some users have access to name and address, but not offices. Some users have access to offices. Some users have access to specific offices. Now, not only does every type, every object have to be handled like with authentication, every single field needs to be validated. This is the reality of backend dev. You always have to check permissions when you do anything. And the thing that's unintuitive for web devs is that use server means that's an endpoint, that's an endpoint. All of these are new API endpoints being exposed. The risk here isn't so much this is a unique problem that doesn't exist in other places and only exists in React and server components and Next. The problem here is that web developers used to using Next purely for front-end stuff and then hitting an API that someone else made with all of these auth things already handled, they're diving into use server and treating it the same way they would hit an external endpoint. Like, to a dev that's not familiar and is used to just writing these things with an existing backend, this to them feels like the equivalent of, I don't know, let's say we have an async function here, it's not use client, and we have some data, const data equals await fetch api.oursite.com/data, and they use this data for something. To a new dev using these things, this feels the same as calling a server action to get that data. They're not used to thinking about API endpoints as a thing they have to own, manage, and authenticate. Reese is pushing back a little bit, saying that focus on auth and permissions is the wrong takeaway because you can't put auth on things you don't know exist. Half agree. I think that our duty as devs is the same way if we have, I don't know, here, where we're exposing all of these things through the switch statement, we're just having back a bunch. So when you use userver, you're just doing this, but you've deleted that, and that. It's still the same thing, but it's important to understand that when you do use userver, you're exposing all of these things as endpoints. And ideally, you're auditing these things as well. What a surprise, CJE already made an ESLint plugin, which disallows top-level userver. So if you don't want this feature, if you don't want this risk, you can use this plugin to guarantee nobody does it, and even use this plugin and then override it in certain files saying, okay, these files can do it, but others can't. These are the issues. Yeah, also 3 minutes ago. Great job, CJE. For those who don't want this, you now have a lint rule to ban it. Really cool. The same way that this exists with basically any backend technology, code review is really important. If there's a file that has a use server on top, you need to make sure every function exported is also authenticated. Very, very important. And it's a common mistake for that to not be the case. But I see this more in GraphQL than I do in React. Just make sure when you're exposing endpoints that you're making sure the user should be using that endpoint. There's a great blog post by Sebastian Markbidge, the wizard who came up with a lot of the server component patterns over at Vercel, how to think about security in Next. And I feel like I reference this blog post far too often. So it's important to bring it up again. The data access layer is a really important concept that they push here, where we have a bunch of things in a folder, let's say data, that are the things we want to have be secured data that can be accessed on the client. So here we have this auth TSX function, should have just been TS, but that's fine. It exports const get current user, which is cached, uses the auth token cookie, decodes it, and now we have this user info. Now we have these functions, can see username, viewer user. This is public info, so we always return true. We have can see phone number. Viewer is admin, or the team that they're asking for is the viewer's team. Get profile DTO. Now we want to make sure that we don't pass back values they shouldn't have access to. So we do this select. We set user data to the first row here. We grab the current user, and if they can see this username, then we call user data.username and we return that. Otherwise, we return null. And the same with phone number. We're using these check functions that we wrote before we return. And since we have this all in a specific folder that is indicated to our teams as this is our API, this is our endpoints, this is important and secure and needs to be treated carefully in code review, we're much less likely to have issues because we've established a pattern of how data is exposed on our server. So as is the case with any technology that is linking to your database and is exposing data, it's important to make sure you have patterns for how you want to do that, for how you want to expose that data. And it might not be intuitive that putting use server at the top of the file means every export is now exposed. Once you know that, you can treat these files properly. So it's important that whenever you use a use server on top, that you make sure each of these functions is checking to make sure the user should be doing the thing that they're doing. One more quick thing, I should have covered this a while ago. You can use server actions with TRPC. So if you really want to lock this down, set up TRPC, use all the things I showed earlier, and now you can just expose those with actions the same way you could otherwise. So we have here create post, protected action dot input, yada yada, dot mutation, create post. And now we can import this the same way we would any other server action, and it just works. You even bind it in a form the same way we were showing earlier. So you get all of the authentication and standardization benefits of what exists within something like TRPC, while also getting the ergonomics, the zero.js necessary, all the other benefits that we get from server actions. It's a really nice hybrid solution. So if you want to have a good standard for the way you're doing this on the server side, there you go. The request that I've seen from Reese and others is that these be tree shook. So if this is exposed and this isn't, because this isn't actually being used in the import, ideally the ID for this isn't included. That would be nice. I would have concerns about how it's actually architected and set up, but I think that should be fine. The concern I would have is that just not exposing the ID doesn't solve the problem, because theoretically, if we only expose user visited in this route, what's the point of this even existing? It almost certainly is exposed somewhere. So if we imported that one, I don't know, in here, even if we don't actually use it, we're just importing it. I guess the reason I'm hesitant to agree with the like tree shaking bit is if you're exporting something in one of these, it's going to get used eventually. So if we were to hide the ID of this function in the pages that don't have access to it, so to speak, it's going to leak eventually. We're effectively just delaying the problem. So the only actual solution is that we are good with use server means this thing needs to be authenticated. And the solution for that isn't a linter. It isn't a change to the way the compiler works. The solution is very specific. It's a code review thing. And I find a lot of the problems that I've been hearing recently are assuming that anyone can commit any code. The solution here is we have a data folder. We put actions in here, and you make sure anytime someone changes anything in the data folder that you have a code owner rule on the repo on GitHub, making sure someone who actually knows what the fuck is going on reviewed that. That's the only way you can use anything that exposes data to users at scale. Make strict rules about who has to review things. And now, whenever I'm doing a code review, even if I can't see the use server on top for some reason because the file's massive, at the very, very least, I see that this file is in the data folder, which means I need to treat it more carefully. It needs to be more thoroughly reviewed, and we need to make sure anything in here is exposing data in a way that is safe. But that is the solution here. It is put these things in a place where we know those are endpoints, and then in code review, make sure any endpoint that you're exporting here is treated accordingly. Otherwise, you're doing the same thing I showed earlier with Express, where we're just exporting functions within like the post calls without checking. You always need to check things that a user can hit. And if you're exporting async functions in a use server file, please, please, please make sure that users are being authenticated. One more simple solution that hasn't been touched on: don't export it. As long as you're not exporting, good. Let me know what you think. And until next time, peace, nerds.